Well, when we come to the 19th century, which I suppose we could call the age of imperialism, if we call the 18th century the age of slavery, and what goes before that the age of adventure or discovery, if we call the 19th century the age of imperialism, we find interestingly that the greatest source of imagery about black people is not paintings, but in fact book illustrations specifically to books that deal with boys' adventure stories in Africa. Now, there was a massive readership for adventure stories, and you had authors like Ballantyne and Buchan and Henty churning out dozens and dozens of titles of books about boys in Africa. And basically these stories are about a few Europeans, a few white boys being pitted against the savage horde of Africa. And the illustrations tend to convey this sense of Europeans fighting dramatically to keep alive notions of decency and civilization against this swamping darkness that is symbolized by the Africans. And of course the Africans outnumber them, so it's a very heroic battle. And if you look at the boys' illustrations, the illustrations to the boys' adventure stories, you find a proliferation of images that deal centrally with notions about civilization and savagery. And of course, the other source of information about the way blacks were represented in the 19th century is military art, where artists would paint the great heroic sort of conquests of Europeans in Africa, representing battle scenes where it's always the blacks who are deeply violent and full of disorder, and the whites trying to maintain a kind of an order and to impose a kind of an order onto this anarchy of discontent.
By the mid-19th century, the superiority of the white man seemed natural and self-evident to Europeans. Nevertheless, various theories were produced in support of this notion. This was the age of scientific racism, of ethnist typologies, facial angles, brain size comparisons, morphological trees, all of which was intended to prove beyond doubt that black people were in all respects vastly inferior to white. Long after the abolition of slavery, these theories provided a justification for the continued dependence on black labor in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. They were also used to justify the subjugation of the black population in Africa itself. The entire continent was carved up between a number of European powers. Chief among them were Britain and France, who chose to view their political and economic domination of Africa as a civilizing mission.
I suppose that one of the finest paintings that I've come across that represents this whole business of savagery and civilization is a painting in the National Portrait Gallery, which shows an African king kneeling to receive the Bible from Queen Victoria. And it seems to me that in this painting are all the elements. This painting almost sums up what imperialism was about. That what is being given to the African is the Bible, and the Bible is the gift of responsibility, it's the gift of literacy, it's the gift of religion, it's the gift ultimately of civilization. And the African is passive, or seen as being a passive recipient, and a grateful recipient to this gift of responsibility, religion, ethics, morality, and civilization.
The grateful recipient of Western civilization was the latest in a long succession of European representations of black people. These are rooted in the power relationship that existed between Europe and Africa. With a gradual rise of European influence from the Renaissance onwards, the black image became steadily more debased.
These images of black people that have been created over a long period of time are still with us, you know. It isn't as if these events which occurred a long time ago are finished and the chapter is closed, because the images are deeply planted in the minds of so many people who are not even conscious of the fact that they have accepted this stereotype of the black man as an inferior. And this is something that is a problem for the societies of today.
Unfortunately, the representation of black people in children's literature is still very racist and based around racist stereotypes. One of the classic books that's taken up in schools and has been printed and reprinted, which just furthers this stereotype, is the story of Robinson Crusoe. Crusoe finds Friday, who is being attacked by cannibals and ends up as Crusoe's slave. Even his name is not his own. He's given the name Friday. Then, of course, there's the idea of the gollywog, which is also clung to, and gollywogs are still being made and still sold as toys. Enid Blyton, of course, often uses the gollywog as the naughty or wicked character in her stories. And the gollywog is a racist stereotype of a black person, has wild, round, staring eyes and big red lips. And then from the idea of the gollywog, we get another so-called children's classic, which is Little Black Sambo. And again, the characters are nothing more than gollywogs. There's no attempt to recreate the real appearance of black people. They're stereotyped in the most grotesque way. It's something that's still done in books for children. This story, again, has the character of the story meeting cannibals, and they're no better than the cannibals from Robinson Crusoe. They're unrealistic, stereotype, grotesque monsters that are only out to attack people, and the illustrations are really very offensive. But what I think is more offensive in children's books is the idea that black people are spear-wielding savages. And this comes up in books like this for older children, with the black man on the cover with feathers in his hair and a bone through his nose, and a skull, whether he's actually holding a skull in his hand, presumably of one of his victims. And then again for younger children, this story again puts forward this idea that black people are spear-wielding savages who have nothing else on their minds but to murder and harass white people.
The idea of the savage horde is one of many images rooted in the 19th century which still exist in British culture today. To what extent is it reinforced by the media?
I think we have to consider the way in which black people are represented in the media when they are there, and then we have to consider the ways in which they are not represented, because they're not there in the media. If we look at the ways they are represented, there are two basic ways. There may be more, but there are two basic ways. First, they are shown as people who are athletes, singers, dancers, celebrities of some kind. That way they may get on the front page or the back page of a newspaper. Secondly, they are shown, usually in large groups, as the source and usually seen as the cause of trouble of a social kind. They are called rioters, people at war with society. Here are the black people again of Toxteth, of Brixton, of Southall. There they are again, out on the streets. And again, that is what we see. That is the main way we do see them represented. I think that we can find in comedy and in humour, and to a certain extent cartoons in newspapers, enormous numbers of examples of racism and of racist stereotyping and of ways of, again, naturalising people's, encouraging white people particularly to think of black people in certain kinds of ways. So making them figures of fun, making vicious jokes, if you like, sometimes, against people as individuals or as a group because of their blackness is perfectly acceptable in lots of popular kinds of culture. It isn't only in the tabloids that this happens. It does happen in the tabloids regularly. Whenever something happens to do with international politics, then it is always an excuse, whether it be about Africans, about Asians. You just bring out any kind of stereotype and use it for a laugh. What we don't see, particularly in the newspapers, and also I think reasonably true to say on broadcast media, particularly television, we don't see black people being ordinary citizens. Black people are not shown as people who lead ordinary lives, who have homes, families, go to work, have friends, have problems, go on holiday. They become absent in mass media representations because one begins to see representations which always say that black people are the people in trouble. The vast majority of black and white people go about their business and try and live an ordinary life. That is not a representation that we will get. Particularly, we won't get it of black people.
How are we to get people to erase from their consciousness or subconsciousness this idea that black men and women are inferior to whites? It goes to the root of the problems of a multiracial society. Now, one of the problems is that it got deeply ingrained at a period when morality was affected by the right of the planter and the slave trading interests to set the stage as to what people believed about those who were producing the wealth in the sugar colonies. And this is the inheritance of today, if you like, to overcome this. And to my mind, one of the best ways to do it is to grasp what it was that led to the creation of these images. And when one understands why they were created, how they were created, who they were created by, then one is better able to overcome them in the conditions of today.